we will give it a few more minutes and get started soon. Thank you all for tuning in. No, we've got plenty on our table, plenty on our plates today, and ongoing. So thanks to all who are tuning in. This is the January meeting of the Wake County Board of Education Policy Committee. We have Ms. Heather Scott is joining us remotely, and I believe Mr. Hegarty, our other colleague, is also here, is also joining us remote. And here we've got Chair Sutton, Vice Chair Mahaffey, and members Karen Carter, Jim Martin, Monica Johnson-Hostler, and Roxy Cash. So thanks to all my colleagues for being here this afternoon. We also have Attorney Jonathan Blumberg is joining us remotely as well. So we'll get started. We've got first agenda before us. There are 4 items, a lot of it to get feedback from the board to the superintendent and her leadership team. So some pressing issues that we'll be discussing. But if I could first get a motion to approve the minutes.
Motion to approve the minutes from the last meeting.
Thank you. Motion from Ms. Mahaffey. Is there a second?
Second.
Second from Dr. Martin. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. And so we will start up with our first item, and it is actually sort of a carryover from yesterday's Student Achievement Committee. Emily Montfort is here to talk with us about professional learning, and there was a previous policy on professional learning that when we did the migration was removed, and we've not replaced it fully yet. R&T has been in place, so we're here to talk about the new policy 3150. Ms. Montfort, thanks for being back with us a second afternoon in a row.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Good afternoon, Ms. Kushner, Policy Committee Chair, School Board Chair Sutton, Superintendent Moore, and board members. Thank you for having me back again 2 days in a row. I'm excited to collaborate with you today around a new board policy around professional learning teams, which we call PLTs. Today, we will share the purpose and intent of the policy. We're going to share how the overall concept and purpose of PLTs are reflected in the proposed policy, and we are going to let you know that the existing R&P is being revised. We seek your feedback today. We are not looking to move this policy forward for adoption at this time. I'm going to begin today by sharing some historical context with you, as well as our steps after this meeting that we will be taking to move forward. I'm then going to review the policy, and then we're going to spend some time hearing from each of you around maybe questions, suggestions you may have to inform our work moving forward. Our district did have a policy that was related to professional learning teams, but it was removed back in 2015 when we migrated policy 1610 professional learning as part of the policy migration project. While we do not have a policy currently related to professional learning teams, we do have existing R&P. And that was last revised in 2010 and is currently being revised by staff. So as we move to get our policy in place, we are also then going to be moving to update our R&P. The Office of Professional Learning has collaborated with the academics leadership team, area superintendents, and the Division of Principals and Assistant Principals to gather feedback and input on the current draft that you are looking at today. The policy has been reviewed by our attorneys, and when approved, this will become the WCPSS specific policy, or a WCPSS specific policy. Currently, the North Carolina School Boards Association does not have a professional learning team policy within their policies to lead the school's manual, nor does any other member district have one. In addition, the State Board of Education does not have a professional learning team policy. Today, like I said earlier, we're going to gather your feedback. Your feedback will help us make revisions and tweaks, and then we are going to gather feedback from teachers. We are going to be meeting and utilizing the Superintendent's Teacher Advisory Council to gather that feedback, and then we're going to continue to work with our collaborative partners, so our area superintendents, the Division of Principals and Assistant Principals, as well as the academics leadership team, to form a policy that then we will return to you for feedback and to be able to move forward. One last note before jumping in, that I did note somewhat at the beginning of my presentation that much of the feedback that we got from those collaborative partners is going to best be utilized as we are working on the R&P. So once this policy is approved, we will be supporting the work to form and revise the R&P that we have. So in advance, I thank you for your time, your energy to help us form a policy that will meet the needs of our stakeholders. So I would like for us to now turn our attention to the policy, and I'm going to walk us through. I have it broken down into 3 sections. So I'll take the first paragraph, then I'm going to take section A, and then section B. And so Ms. Kushner, as we go through each of those steps, I'm hoping that you can help me sort of facilitate the feedback, since you're in the room and you can kind of see our virtual attendees as well. And I'm thinking, just due to time, if we can keep each of those feedbacks somewhere like around 6 minutes would probably be good for the breaks, okay?
Sounds good. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. I also want to note that I have Wendy Clark and Phil Eccles from my department on the meeting as well, and they're going to be diligently taking notes and feedback for us as I facilitate this for us. So looking at the first paragraph, the Wake County Board of Education believes a strong relationship exists between professional learning, coaching, and collaboration of employees, and the quality of instruction provided to students and support provided to schools. Accordingly, the board strongly supports participation in team-based collaboration and believes it is vital to provide staff the time for collaboration and planning in professional learning teams, PLTs. The district supports and expects the structure of PLTs to be provided for staff at all levels. So I'll pause there for an opportunity for any feedback or questions or suggested revisions.
Any feedback from board members? I think it's a strong opening statement. All right, on to Section A.
Awesome. Okay, Section A, definition of professional learning teams. A professional learning team focuses on identified problems of practice, targeted goals, specific standards, assessments, and/or design and delivery of instruction. PLTs function both within schools and within various other departments of the district. PLTs bridge the gap between staff knowing how to do something and actually doing it by transforming knowledge and skill development to the practices and refinements necessary for full implementation in the classroom and workplace. PLTs are part of a larger community known as a professional learning community, PLC. PLTs work interdependently to support common goals of the PLC. PLTs may be organized in vertical, same subject, or cross-disciplinary teams. They regularly convene either in person or virtually to strengthen their practice and increase student achievement. PLT members work collectively to achieve the shared goals outlined in the school improvement plan and the district strategic plan. PLTs are driven by high expectations, shared goals, professionalism, and accountability. And I'll open it up for feedback on that section.
Not seen any hands quite yet.
Okay.
Is there any discussion, is there a need to further put any more additional definitions around PLT or PLC? Or do you guys feel comfortable with where this is in policy? Dr. Martin.
Ms. Kushner, I'll just stay because, I mean, the lack of discussion, I think, is, you know, kind of frustrating as an educator. To me, I'm still scratching my head a little bit on the policy purpose. Absolutely support PLTs. They're a critical part of, you know, functioning, but I'm struggling a little bit to understand the policy aspect of the PLT. Policy is generally a governing document. So I'm not quite, this is a very definitional document. And I think we largely agree with the definitions. As I looked at this policy, the closest I could find to sort of, you know, governing policy aspects are a commitment to time. So that I suppose could be a policy requirement that the board is saying, make sure you set aside time. And there's also possibly the policy statement that we expect that PLTs be provided for staff at all levels. So I think those two are the policy statements. But I think the reason, at least for me, sort of the lack of discussion is I think most of the language here is kind of obvious, definitional. But I think the question is why do we need a policy for PLTs? right? Just because things exist doesn't necessarily need a policy. And I think that's a question we should always ask when we write policy. Are we writing policy to have a policy, or is there a reason for it? Like I say, the closest I can find in this current document is setting aside time and ensuring that all staff have access to it. I can see that there could be value for that, but maybe we need to see the RNP to understand what about the RNP requires that a policy exists. So
Yeah,
that to me is why there's little discussion and question right now, is because I'm not sure that at least I'm not sure I see what's the policy aspect of this policy.
well, I think.
Am I the only one that felt that way?
No, and I think it's a descriptor, and so does it need to be in policy? Chair Sutton, and I want to ask Superintendent Moore to think about. Thanks.
I had some thoughts along the same way. I just say not reason for no discussion. I just was going to wait until we got to the end and hear it all the way through before making any sort of comment or judgment. I did wonder what the need or purpose, and I assume at some point that staff was going to get into what was driving the need for this. But as I go through, I do see the value, and sometimes our policies aren't necessarily governing or even, for lack of a better word, punitive, but sometimes underscore our belief in the importance of something. And so to Dr. Martin's point, underscoring our belief in the importance of time. I also see, focus on the point around collaboration, and that we value and have a strong belief in the need for staff to collaborate, for teachers and teams to collaborate, to that we set aside time for that. And then looking at the functions, once we get into the next section, that we also place a high value on continuous improvement and the things listed in Section B, the collective responsibility and alignment and accountability. So that's
And
what
I see Mr. Blumberg has his hand up. I'm asked Superintendent Moore to augment some of this. And then Mr. Blumberg, if you don't mind chiming in after Superintendent Moore. Thank you.
Absolutely.
So it may be helpful, and Julie and Emily have got this background, I'm sure, but PLC was in a prior policy that we had, and it wasn't migrated as part of other policies. And I think there was some specific language around requirements and times and meetings that were expected at the school level. And so I think that that portion of the language didn't make it over into whatever other policies we've looked at for professional learning, so they were looking at a place to keep it. And I think Dr. Martin is exactly right around where some of the more specifics of how to implement would come into an RMP. So, but I'm going to let Emily and or Julie talk any further about that.
Yeah, you're correct, Kathy, and Julie may want to chime in on the prior policy, but a lot of the specifics about the time and those items would definitely be reflected in the RMP, and you can see some of that reflected in the current RMP that's in place that we're working to revise. But Julie, you may have some more expansion on like what was in the former PL policy and why it used to be in policy and now it's not, and so this is an attempt to bring it back into place.
Sure. Our old policy was 3610, professional learning teams, and it included this language. The Board of Education strongly supports team-based collaboration as the means to continuous improvement and the achievement of school and district goals. A PLT is made up of members who regularly collaborate toward continued improvement and meeting student needs. Using data, professional experience, and best practice, the team works toward realizing a shared vision for better learning environment and improved student outcomes. The primary emphasis of this work is on the support of learning and meeting the needs of all students. Professional learning teams increase student achievement within the framework of multi-tier system of supports and the effective teaching framework. And then it goes on to include that they meet regularly and all certified staff members are expected to participate. Central services staff members will participate regularly in centrally based learning teams. And then it lists some other, just a few bullet points about the characteristics that a PLT has. This language specifically did not migrate into professional learning 1610, which was the big policy that migrated then during the policy migration project. This language was left out. So in the absence of a PLT policy and the presence of an RMP that includes specifics on how often you should meet, how long those meetings should be, we really believe that the statement or the existence of a policy would be really a statement by the board that this is something the board values and a way that we expect our employees to work together. And we do have multiple references in other policies on grading, for example, about how we expect PLTs to make decisions. So we have them operating in other policies, but there's not a policy in which we define them and state their functions.
Thank you, Dr. Crane. And Mr. Blumberg, did you want to
Yeah,
add
and-
some legal perspective?
Sure, and this really just follows up almost exactly what Julie was talking about, that it is certainly a permissible basis for the board in adopting policy to state, to express an important philosophy or principle of the board. I mean, obviously, you have policies for a number of other reasons. The law requires that you have a policy, or for legal protection, or to restate in critical tenets of the law to remind staff, such as reporting policies. But there is a space for the board to have a policy when it's important to articulate an important principle, philosophy. And I think what staff is saying here is that PLTs form a critical function in carrying out the mission of the system, whether it's through the strategic plan or through school improvement plans. And so I think this policy is there from a philosophical level to do that, to state the board's critical endorsement of PLTs. And then there's the technical reason why it would need to be there, because you have an existing R&P. That doesn't mean that you need to be boxed in. You can decide not to have an R&P and so on and so forth. But I think that's where it stands at a real high level.
Thank you, sir.
So if I may, I wonder about a little bit more streamlining, because I read this policy about 3 times last night to try to figure out why it existed as why it was coming forward as a policy. And I hear some of what you're saying. I'm not sure how well that's communicated, and I think we might be able to communicate those things a little bit clearer, and potentially even, a section C-ish, which is the specific implications of the policy, that we're saying that the time needs to be set aside, that everybody needs to. At the same time, I hope that we don't get the professional learning teams to be a little bit too restrictive. Collaboration works well when it's organic and authentic. And working with teachers, I have heard reports of very, very effective professional learning teams and very robotic, sort of check-the-box professional learning teams. And in school settings where people maybe tried to hold a little too tight to R&P that says there must be this PLT, and there are reports where people are required to fill out the assessments, right? This was our goal, this is what we did, and they spend more time on the assessment than actually working together to actually be functional. So I would hope that our policy and R&P doesn't create this framework that's too structured and doesn't recognize that organic PLTs oftentimes are the most creative and most effective. So,
And I think may perhaps review the policy with the R&P with that eye might be useful. So thank you. Ms. Mahaffey, and then I think Dr. Garner wants to chime in.
Thank you. And Ms. Mountford, thank you to you and your team for front-loading all of the feedback that you're going to be soliciting from this policy and talking about the work that you're pulling out, needing for the RNP. I'm curious, based on Dr. Martin's comments, if maybe making sure that we link to the RNP. I think having that definition and letting people know in our policy what the parameters of a PLT is. So if you're a parent and you hear that term and you're not sure what it is and why it's required, that can be helpful. But having the nuts and bolts of the timing, the meetings, the parts of an RMP, so we're not always in RMP, so we're not always bringing it back to the board as those adjustments are made in order to allow for that more organic feel that Dr. Martin's talking about may be appropriate. And that's just my wonder.
Thank you, Ms. Mahaffey. Dr. Garner? I like it.
Thank you, Ms. Kirshner. I just wanted to extend some of the thoughts that have been expressed so far, and Jonathan and Julie and Emily have really done a nice job, but I will add a few things. We appreciate the reaction and response that you're sharing with us to this policy, and we want to be able to incorporate some of the thoughts and reactions that you're having to it, either through modification of language or further review of the policy. But I will say that, as you members of the board know for some time, much attention and energy has been devoted to helping build our teachers' capacity, as well as other staff members' capacity to operate in a collaborative-based team such as professional learning teams, to, one, inform instructional practices, to impact instructional practices, and to impact student achievement. And so multiple things are trying to be accomplished here. One, as already indicated, to fill any gaps we have in policy that speaks to a professional learning team, because we as a district do value the importance of a professional learning team. We're committed to that structure for teachers to operate within as far as a collaborative-based approach and avenue to address student achievement, as well as any other goals they have within their school tied to school improvement. So it is to fill a gap that we've recognized in our policy, but also to express very clearly and very explicitly to our district that we value, we recognize, and we know the importance of operating in a team-based structure like PLTs. And so this particular policy in its current format speaks to what you've already stated about our belief as a district, the principles of it, the concepts of it, with the RMP later to outline the more mechanics of expectations of how they should function within a school or a central-based environment, central services-based environment. It's clear that we want these teams and collaboration to be exercised both at the school level as well as central services level. And even principals form themselves in POTs. So it is to speak to the value as well as to address a gap. And some of the comments, Dr. Martin, you're sharing, we appreciate that insight. And some of that we will have the opportunity to unpack a little bit more of that when we carry it to our teachers in the Superintendent's Teacher Advisory Council for that very thing, about what they need to see in a policy, what they want to see in a policy to support their work, and how they're viewing POTs as well. So you're exactly right in the approach we're using this. It is to clearly and explicitly state our commitment as a district to POTs, as well as to fill a gap we are currently seeing within our policy. And RMP will spell out a lot more of the mechanics that you've mentioned here. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Ms. Kirshner.
Thank you, Dr. Garner. Any other comments on A before we ask Ms. Montfort to go over Section B and then also open it back up to some general feedback from the board? Ms. Montfort wanted to go on and just go over Section B, and then we'll get back to it with some overall comments. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, Section B, functions of professional learning teams. 1, engage teachers in continuous improvement. PLTs apply a cycle of continuous improvement to engage in inquiry, action, research, data analysis, planning, implementation, reflection, and evaluation. 2, develop collective responsibility. PLTs share collective responsibility for the learning of all students within the school or district. Within PLTs, peer accountability fosters a commitment to collaborative professionalism. PLTs build collective efficacy and strengthen interdependence through the shared responsibility for learning and professional growth. Each student benefits from the strengths and expertise of every educator when teams learn together. 3, create alignment and accountability. Professional learning that occurs within PLTs aligns with and ensures implementation of school and district initiatives. PLTs align and monitor their goals with those of the school and district and hold all members collectively accountable for results.
So as Ms. Montfort said, they're not looking for us to move this to action for approval, just asking for some overall feedback. I mean, I do recognize, I think to Dr. Martin's point, that this is a policy that's unique to Wake County, but it's also, in my time on the board, I see it as PLTs as truly deep in our culture of how teachers learn from each other, and it also leverages the strengths of our size as a district. But I think to your point, Dr. Martin, it also needs to allow for that organic creativity that so many of our teachers have, that I then hope would be shared with other similar PLTs and other, it's a way of sharing best practices and engaging all of our teachers in improving their craft and their profession. But I also want to draw attention to the last sentence of the opening paragraph. The district supports and expects the structure of PLTs to be provided for staff at all levels. So I don't know if there's any feedback from the board as to that this is not just teachers, but and certified staff, but central services staff. Do we also expect it for other staff members, or is this strictly for certified staff, Ms. Montfort? Because I would hope that we have PLTs for IAs, for some of our other support staff that are working with our students.
Ms. Kushner, we specifically made sure that this policy was able to reflect all of our staff, whether not just certified, not just teachers, that are operating within PLTs. And so we have staff that are at the school level and the central office level that are collaborating routinely within PLTs. And so that sentence is reflective of that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Martin.
So I would like to just point out the last sentence in B3 is one of those sentences that gives me pause. I just ask any students in any class I've ever taught. People know that I expect accountability, I expect standards, and so on and so forth. But when I read that statement, flags go off, right, that says we're going to align and monitor their goals and those of the school and the district and hold all members collectively accountable for results. That's the very language that led to standardized testing. It leads to here, right? SMART goals, for example, can be very useful in terms of actually getting something done, but they can also be borderline deadly when we so needed to be accountable to our goal, we make our SMART goal this, thing where we can check off the box and say, look, we were accountable to it. We can spend so much time worrying about accountability that we forget to do it's the do that's more important than the accountability. And sometimes, particularly with a PLT, you want a group of teachers and IAs and other staff to collaborate together and brainstorm and get the ideas and then go back and make them work in whatever setting we need them to work in. But if we have an over-focus on accountability, then we've got our spreadsheet where we're filling in the box that says, this is what we did with our time. So I just caution that the language of that last sentence is exactly what gives me a red flag as an educator in a classroom, because more often than not, when I see that kind of language, it diminishes the organic creativity and maximizes the, oh yeah, here's another thing I've got to do just because I got to do it.
So around the issues of accountability, so.
Right. And I would just say that that's not the intent. But
I
if you-
understand that's not
but
the
if
intent,
you-
but it can be
and
taken
I think
that
you
way.
can see that, I think you might be able to see it in RMP and how it's aligned, but the converse of that, to not be explicit about the need to align with school improvement plans and the work that's prioritized at the school, it's important to make that explicit, make that connection explicit. But I understand what you're saying.
Okay, so to come back with perhaps some further perspective on that concern from Dr. Martin.
Because
And
we live in
Mrs.
a
Scott
world-
and Mr.
We live in a world where accountability has been so overused and abused that it actually has diminished the creativity of educators, and that's my primary reason for raising this issue.
Yeah, I hear you asking staff for some feedback. I think that's useful perspective. Ms. Scott, and who's online, and Mr. Hegarty, if y'all could go one and then the other. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Kushner. I appreciate this very much, the policy and the intent behind it. Understanding that we are looking to encourage PLTs, that we acknowledge that they exist within different roles, teachers, et cetera. I was just wondering about NB1, that first, just the title, to engage teachers in continuous improvement. I was wondering if that was phrased that way intentionally, or if that is something that could potentially be changed to reflect all employees. So I was just a little curious about that.
That's wonderful feedback, Ms. Scott. And we want to make sure, as I just said, that the policy is reflective of all of our staff. So I'll definitely take that back to the team. Thank you.
Thank you. That was my only question, Ms. Kushner.
Thank you, Ms. Scott. And Mr. Hegarty, I think he has a question for you, Mr. Blumberg, perhaps Dr. Garner. Mr. Hegarty.
Thank you, Ms. Kushner. So this question, I think, is more directed toward council first and perhaps Dr. Gardner. At our last policy committee, I had a question about a past policy, a policy we were considering then, and the legal references. Every policy that you present to us at the bottom of the draft prepared by staff lists legal references. And so I'd like to know, Mr. Blumberg, why do we list legal references, and are they important?
The legal references have historically been included in policies. They certainly are from the School Boards Association as well, where they put legal references in there. I think it can allow a reader to expand upon their research about a policy, to be able to see, is this policy something that's required by statute, just aligned with statute or law, if there's a particular case. So it does allow a reader to amplify, as well. If there's a change in the law, it's easier for us, oh, this law's changed, we can go look at policy and realize that we may need to change policy related to that. We do look at legal references. Sometimes they need to be changed and the like. The School Boards Association often updates those. So that's the general rationale. There is not a legal requirement that there be legal references to a policy. I appreciate the question. Happy to entertain any follow-ups to it.
Thank you, because I wouldn't have asked if I didn't have some follow-ups. So during the last policy committee meeting, I decided to follow some of these links. And in one of the past policy drafts, the links went to a policy, NCDPI policy that was non-existent. There was no policy with that citation, and so I pointed that out to staff. And so now I am in the habit of checking all of these links. And so in this policy and several other policies presented today, we have references to statute and we have references to state policy. And I don't know if these are references that are passed down to us from the School Boards Association, or if we check these and verify these independently. If they have not been checked, I will tell you they should be. The school board policy, for example, that's referenced, the state policy that's referenced for this policy is a policy on rigor. But I don't see any connection to that policy on rigor and the professional learning teams. And I don't know if there was supposed to be a reference to a different policy that might be connected to professional learning teams, or if there's a connection to a state policy on rigor that I haven't seen the connection to. As I go down these statutes, you know, they're all in the general educational statute 115C, but they start from school boards have the ability to govern schools, which seems incredibly broad. Of all of these listed, you do have one that talks about duties of teachers, which I think might be relevant here as we talk about their duty regarding a professional learning team. But then you also have references to statutes that have been repealed.
Yes, the repealed statute, I looked at that today, and talked to Julie, that's going to be taken out. So that's already going to be removed. But yes, they in general, the references come from the School Boards Association for policy, and we will make sure and appreciate your astuteness on this and attentiveness. We will double check to make sure that they are applicable. But there is, and I'm just telling you the history, there is a long history of having the sort of authorizing statutes, as you pointed out, the statutes that basically say the school board has this general authority, and to be very sort of generous in the connections to the policy. So the academic rigor policy is in general related to that professional learning teams are a way to bring about academic rigor. But yes, they're cousins, but they're not exactly the same. And so that has been historically the sort of approach. I am absolutely open to an approach that to only cite a legal reference if it is directly on point. I'm absolutely open to that. That has not been the way it's been done historically, and we generally do follow the approach of the School Boards Association. But I don't have a problem with that approach, and sort of welcome that moving forward, if that's the pleasure of the board, to only cite a law or a case that's sort of on point, so that it's immediately helpful if you go look at it, as opposed to more generally relevant. I'm open to that, and I appreciate the conversation and the feedback.
Thank you, Mr. Blumberg. And again, I don't have a recommendation whether it should be so narrow that it's specific to the exact issue, or if it does, contain a broader scope of power. I was looking for some consistency, and then again, where some of these citations don't seem to match up, like for example, the statute 81 that you referenced that has been repealed, or where this policy on rigor doesn't on its face seem to connect, but maybe there is a connection that you're aware of. I'm just trying to get a little bit of explanation behind why some are included, why some weren't. So I appreciate your thoughts and your advice on that.
If I could just add, for example, on the state board policy, it talks about what educators must do. And under item 6 under that, it says educators must work collaboratively with other faculty members and staff. So that's the link. Is it a sufficient link that it's worth citing? It's a debatable point, but I appreciate the question. Ms. Kushner, would you mind if I just, since I have the floor, just to elaborate 1 second on a point that's come up a few times, if I could?
Sure, yes, thank you.
Okay, on that sentence that you raised, which was the last sentence of the first paragraph, where it does talk about the board, previously talking about the board fully sort of supporting the idea of PLTs, and then it goes on to say the district supports and expects the structure of PLTs to be provided for all staff at all levels. I do, want the board and staff to continue to explore the meaning of that. I understand the staff's been very clear that PLTs go beyond just teachers, and I understand that. The word expects to me is one that I want to make sure that I have sort of clarity on, if that sentence is going to stay in there, because is it a requirement? I mean, is the board saying that PLTs are required across the district in all categories for all staff, essentially at all times? Is that a requirement? And so, or not? And so expects is just, makes me raise that question. And I guess the other thing about that sentence is that the sentence before, really, you're talking about the board. This is what the board's philosophy is, and it says the board strongly supports that. But the next one, the sentence that we're talking about, is now the district, and I'm wondering what that shift is. And I guess ultimately, I wonder whether it's necessary to have that sentence if we already have the philosophical statement that the board is saying that they support it, throughout. So that's just a question that I think, I know that it's not here for action, but I think it's perhaps worthy of some further discussion and exploration.
Thank you. No, I think it's a good issue to raise.
Well, to that point, I think the expects and all, those are big words. I think, for example, right, our custodial staff are part of our staff. Do we expect there to be PLTs for our custodial staff? On the flip side is, I have known, because I've seen it in my kids' school, where the custodians sometimes were really involved with different groups of students. And so to involve them in certain PLTs, particularly for school improvement plans or something else, could be extremely valuable. So I think the intent is that all staff should be considered to be part of PLTs.
And valued.
And valued. I think all levels of staff deserve professional development. Is that a formal PLT or is it not a formal PLT? That's a point of question. Mm-hmm. But I think as soon as we get the expects and all language, then we have to say, to your point, Mr. Bloomberg, what does that mean? I don't think we want to exclude anybody from a PLT. So we don't want teachers saying, no, UIAs aren't part of the PLT.
Right. And so I think it's going to...
So it's tough language.
And how can we put that in policy is the other question. Superintendent Moore, did you want to add to that? Or
I was just going to say, I think that the notion of how staff in other divisions or departments or classified staff engage, what PLTs is contemplating really is collaboration that has intent. And so I think that's, and rather than separate policies or separate language or other places, that if we can come up with language that makes it sort of clear that across all levels and divisions of the organization, there's an expectation along the lines of what we do with PLTs, that collaboration with intent is occurring in support of schools and students, et cetera, that's really what we're trying to get at.
Thank you, Superintendent Moore. So I think it's something we need to reflect on as we're ruminating over this policy. Any other board members who haven't shared any thoughts? Or I think to Mr. Hegarty's point, which is an important overall point about the legal citations, I think given that we don't govern alone, that we are so need to make sure that we are following state and federal statutes. I've welcomed in policy having those citations. Absolutely, we should check and make sure that they're accurate, and there may be policies that don't have this one certainly is a unique Wake County policy, may not need to have any citations, either legal or to the state board policies. So I think it's a good thing for us to question and raise when we're looking at any policy revision. So thank you, Mr. Hegarty, before I let that point go unnoticed. Any other feedback from staff, from board members? I think Ms. Montfort, you've gotten quite a bit of feedback from us, both yesterday and today, on professional learning teams, and we look forward to continuing to hone this policy down. I think as you've heard some concerns, but also support of how this is integrated into our Wake County public school system. And so is your plan to bring it back with the RNP so we have some greater clarity as well as answering some of these concerns?
Absolutely. We came so we could be collaborative with y'all. Y'all are one of our collaborative partners as we're working to craft this. And so I appreciate all the feedback. And I think the suggestion of having that piece for y'all to be able to frame your work and making decisions about the policy to also be able to look at the RMP is important. And so, like I said, we're going to be seeking stakeholder feedback from our teachers and also working with those other collaborative partners that I mentioned earlier before we bring it back to y'all.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you for your time today.
So our next item is Dr. Gardner and Dr. Crane bringing an overview of the next policy series that we're going to be migrating, 6,000 series on support services. So to introduce that, Dr. Crane, Dr. Gardner.
Ms. Kirshner, thank you. This is to provide a very introductory stage and level for transitioning to the series of 6,000 policy with regard to our migration. And this one, as you will see, and as Julie will walk you through it, is really almost like a preamble to the whole policy section. She's going to outline for you the types of areas that are covered in specific policies under the 6,000 division. This policy is very general in nature. It just kind of makes a broad statement about the commitment of the district to provide support systems, as you will see in the language. It is not intended to get in specifics of areas like child nutrition services, transportation, others that will come in turn as you look at the policy specific to those areas. It really is just to set the stage for commitment. And at this time, I'm going to let Julie walk you through the current one with some proposed revisions in wording. And again, it will set the stage for us over the next months to bring to you policies from this 6,000 series for you to dive into those specific areas of support that's provided to the schools and through central services. So thank you, Ms. Kirshner and board members. Julie?
Sure. Thanks, everyone, for giving me an opportunity to share this with you. As you know, we are going through the policy migration project. We're migrating our policies from our old policy manual to our new policy manual. And those policies are aligned or guided by the policies to lead the schools manual that the North Carolina School Boards Association has. Our next series is the 6,000 series, and that series is titled Support Services. What does that include? Well, the 6100s are student health services. The 6200s are student food services. We reference that as child nutrition services. 6300s will be student transportation services. 6400s are our purchasing function. And the 6500s will be policies about equipment, materials, and supplies. I'm going to share with you now the language around Policy 6000, which is an introductory policy for the entire series. When I read this policy, I heard our board members speak clearly, because as I listen to you, I hear you say continually that you value and understand the importance of the support services of our district and how they impact and contribute to our students in classrooms every day. Each student every day. Our support services reach them. So it made sense to me, and it made sense to chiefs and SLT and our attorneys who reviewed this to bring this policy to you for your consideration. So it is Policy 6000, Support Services. We've changed a few things. You'll see this in blue. So the policy reads that the Wake County Board of Education recognizes that an effective educational program must be supported by services that assist students in accessing educational opportunities to receive a sound basic education. The board also recognizes the need for services that help the school system use resources necessary for an educational program in an effective and efficient manner. The board and superintendent will continue to collaborate with the Wake County Board of Commissioners and other funding sources to highlight the importance of support services. And our legal references down at the bottom do include Leandro, for example, and you'll hear that language in a sound basic education up in the first sentence. So ready to hear your feedback on this policy.
Thank you, Dr. Crane. I appreciate the capitalization of board, I have to say. So thank you. My little pet peeve. So thank you. Yeah, sets it up well, Ms. Mahaffey says. Any other feedback from the, she went through the, this encompasses a great deal, student health services, child nutrition services, transportation, purchasing, and equipment. So as you all think through in the coming month, some of your concerns that you've heard from constituents, from staff, from students, from educators that you want to bring forward, just think that we are getting to that work. So, and I'm glad to see Leandro also referenced. So it might do some board members may serve you well to look at the latest West Ed report and see how some of the specifics and general ideas that report had on the Leandro decision. So, all right. Any other questions, Ms. Johnson-Hostler, and then Dr. Martin?
Thank you earlier for the conversation about legal references. And thank you, Dr. Crane, for walking us through this and making clear that you've heard the board's perspective. And I guess because we referenced Leandro, but this is a very vague policy. And so I guess my question to us as a board to consider as we provide more feedback is, personally, for me, I would not recommend that we leave this policy vague. I think it's our one space to leave an institutional mark on the importance of a Leandro. While we're not a low-wealth county, which is where Leandro started, we certainly have schools where the majority of those students are from low-income families. And so for me, I'd like to see us be clear that we're speaking into Leandro here and not just drop it at the bottom as a reference. But again, it's a new policy. It's something for us all to think through, but I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the fact that we reference a policy, but yet this is extremely vague and technically doesn't speak into anything new or different we would be doing in policy.
Thank you for that, Dr. West of the commission often makes the point that in Wake County, with our population, we have more students who are living in poverty and people living in poverty than some rural counties' total population, because we are such a large county.
He would also be glad to hear me quote him right behind you, is that he also thinks it's important that we speak to vulnerable populations clearly articulate in our policy, and that's exactly what I'm trying to articulate. So thank you for reminding me of Dr. West's comments.
Thanks for that clarification. Dr. Martin.
I share the same perspective that Ms. Johnson-Hostler just raised. This is an extremely general policy. It's sort of, that's the job of the board. I also accept that, I guess, if this were the old-fashioned policy manual where you actually had a notebook, this would be the preamble paragraph. So I accept that, even though if I look at it as a standalone policy, it feels far too general. With respect to the Leandro, I've just been reading, actually, some of those things for talking to a group of students tomorrow. But a lot of the critiques of the West Ed report are a recognition that it stopped at the sound basic education, which is a minimalist definition. And so I question whether we want to use, I understand that the sound basic education is in the Constitution, but that really is a minimalist lowest bar. And a lot of the critique that I'm seeing of the West Ed report and even of our Constitution is, are we really satisfied with the minimal bar or not? So I just, again, feel like we need to raise that. Sound basic is kind of the floor. I really think we want more than the floor as part of Wake County Public School System.
Thank you. No arguments from me. We just,
Julie, do you have some of can you iterate some of the policies that would come in the 6,000 series to have an understanding of the sort of the universe of what's covered?
Sure. Well, within student health services, for example, table here, in student health services, we talk about what are the goals of student health services, administering medications to students, for example, student wellness policy. Once we hit our student food services, we talk about policies on how they're organized, how it operates, free and reduced price food services, nutritional standards. Once we move into student transportation, now we're talking about safety and student transportation services, policies about school bus idling, bus fleet management, drivers, routes and stops, use of student transportation, student assignment to buses, parking for students and visitors. Once we move into purchasing function, now we're really talking about ethics and the purchasing function, participation of by historically underutilized businesses, contracts with the board, pre-audit certification, state purchasing requirements for equipment, materials, and supplies, our vendor lists, bidders lists, and then finally under equipment, materials, and supplies, we talk about the use of them, personal use of it, network security, resource conservation, vandalism, disposal of surplus property, et cetera.
Okay.
So it really is a very overarching policy just to say these things are important.
And I think that's kind of where I was headed with my point, is that this 6,000 support services encompasses things that are, a lot of them are largely operational in nature, but there are some other pieces as well. And so how we craft language that I think, as Ms. Johnson-House was saying and Dr. Martin, it may be more intentional around how we are reaching our groups of students is important. But I just wanted to make sure that we understood that it's not just, that may need to be in lots of other places and policies that we have, not just here, right?
No,
so
thank
because
you.
so much of this is very operational in nature.
you
So
for
I was
that.
just sort of pointing out, I understand it, I think it makes sense of what we want to do, but we really want to look at that even bigger than just
Yeah.
6,000.
Thank
Well,
you.
do we even want the Leandro reference, for example? I mean, this
Well,
is a.
that was my point. If
this
this
is a
isn't about
mechanical-
it, then it shouldn't be there.
Yes, this is a mechanical intro paragraph to a section. And by putting Leandro in, it feels like we're saying something that we're not saying. So maybe we should just back off and let it be the mechanical paragraph to the policy that might be a little bit more rational.
I do think there's also, because, and this is from the School Boards Association as well, is that right, Julie?
Yes.
So when you think about the context of all of the districts in North Carolina and the extent to which they have support and emphasis for support services and operations of schools and how Wake County is, I think we all have needs. But I think there's some of the context of the need for this policy and this language is reflective of the wide variety of sort of support and emphasis on support services that exist in other districts.
Thank you.
Or
And
does it?
Ms. Scott has a comment.
Oh, go ahead, sorry.
I don't want to lose track of that. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I wanted to make sure that I'm understanding that this policy is a vague policy to describe the series of related policies in the 6,000 series. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So just from my, I guess the board would need to agree, on the purpose of that, because I think that citing Leandro, knowing that is to do with funding to provide a sound basic education and funding being a big part of that, and then mentioning within this policy, collaborating, which I love to see that, collaborate with the Wake County Board of Commissioners and other funding sources, because I feel like it's my understanding that my colleagues and I both want to make sure we're meeting those needs, but also disrupting systemic inequities, that have led to so many students in vulnerable positions in life. So I kind of feel like that part is important to have in there, as long as these additional policies within the series are highlighting funding, either by advocating for them or just noting that this is a cost that we need to work on. Or I don't know. I hope I'm making sense. I'm kind of thinking as I'm talking, so I apologize for that.
I understand. Mr. Blumberg, are you trying to answer Mrs. Scott's issues?
Yeah, one suggestion that I would have is, since this is really just supposed to kick off the series at a really high level and to stress that the board really values these services, operational services and otherwise, that one suggestion would be to take the first sentence and end it with opportunities, and not add to receive a sound basic education. That, I think, avoids setting that as the standard when there is not uniformity on the board that should be the standard in Wake County, but still gets the point across that these are important services. And it keeps then the last paragraph about collaboration in, and we could take the Leandro reference out. I think that would still kick off the series, but in a way that doesn't have you have to resolve what is the standard and to then go sort of bird walk through a full issue on Leandro. That's just a thought.
Mr. Hegarty, I see your hand up.
Thank you, Ms. Kushner. So I was just going to take the opposing view that through the Leandro decision and the different reports of action, actions recommended to the court and that by the court order are required of LEAs include, provision of support services. And so to me, the policy in this language signifies our intent to comply with the Leandro order and to provide these services. I understand the points raised by my colleagues, but I disagree, and I like the language as it's written, and I like the reference to Leandro.
Yeah, it's not either or. In some ways, we can have it. Perhaps it's what we need to underscore throughout our policies. So is there any, Dr. Martin?
Well, I just want to, in part, concur with you, Mr. Hegarty. My challenge is that in the citation of the things in the 6,000 series, I really didn't hear much of anything that gets at Leandro. And so that's the disconnect. And so I guess you all know, I look for a little bit of honesty in policy. So if we're looking at things to address Leandro, of which there are things we need to do, I'm not sure that the 6,000 series addresses those maybe as much as, say, the academic programs do, for example. So that's my disconnect.
Well, I don't see it as an either or. I guess. So I wanted to ask Dr. Crane. Are you, just to clarify, and Dr. Gardner, you are looking for this one to be approved to get us started on the migration and to get it approved at an upcoming meeting?
Yes.
Okay. And Mr. Sutton?
Yeah, just two thoughts, I guess, or a suggestion. If there was some hesitancy around the receive a sound basic education, that the end of that sentence could read, must be supported by services that promote educational equity. And then maybe put a period there, and then we might take a stab at defining what educational equity means in a quick Google search of educational equity is a measure of achievement, fairness, and opportunity for all students. And so I think that's what we're really talking about when we're talking about receiving a sound basic education, and even captures the word opportunity, but also captures the words achievement and fairness, which points to students. So some version of that might be helpful. And then the other question that I had was that in the second part where we talk about collaborating with the Wake County Board of Commissioners and other funding sources, is there a particular reason why we don't name the state as well, and maybe say the Board of Commissioners, the state, and other funding sources, particularly when we're referencing Leandro? It's the state who funds Leandro, obviously, and there's a legal reference at the bottom that has Leandro versus the state. Would it not be helpful to, because it seems like we're just kind of putting the burden on the county commissioners, and we don't mention any other funding partners or funding sources, and quite frankly, the state is our biggest funding partner in the county commissioners and federal government.
And they do fund transportation services, and we are following state purchasing requirements, and I guess child nutrition is federal, so that's a great feedback. Dr. Crane, did you can we add federal and state? sources?
There was a reason why we didn't. I'm
Yeah.
just kind of asking
All
why.
right. Yes. Is there a reason? Thank you.
Julie, I can.
In our discussion during Chiefs, we really landed on the fact that as a policy that's created by the State School Boards Association, and I know that we've mentioned this before, this policy is created for all school boards, and not all school boards have the relationship with their county commissioners that we do. Not all counties have the capital or the will to generate that to support their school systems. So that language in the policy, and we shifted it some so that we could say continue to collaborate with, rather than to say strive to educate, because we believe our county commissioners are very well aware of how support services and how they support our school district and what that means for our kids in schools every day. So that was some of the background in our discussion.
And I would say for that same reason is why I would advocate for adding the state, because we are sensitive to the collaborative relationship that we have with the county commissioners. And I, for one, at least don't want it to seem like we're putting that burden on just the county commissioners. That is one that should be shared by the state, or proportionally shared by the state as well. And so that, when I read that, that's how it comes across to me. And I just wonder if I were one of the county commissioners, would I feel the same way or read it the same way, that we're trying to burden the county commissioners with that when that's not our intent, and we do value that collaborative nature. And because of that, we don't want to just seem like it's being shared by just the commissioners, and not our other partners.
Lots of
That's just me.
nodding in the room, Dr. Crane. So I think we're making a motion to, or we're asking that you add state funding or state leaders. Is that what?
Ms. Kirshner,
Yeah.
and to extend Julie's comments a little bit further, and Mr. Sutton, there was really no specific reason why it was not included. I think it's a very good point to highlight the partnership that occurs between the county and the state as well. So if it is the interest of the board to add that, I don't think there's a problem in adding that in all. And I do like it a lot. There was no reason why it was not included in the first, but I think to your point, it certainly can be added if that's the interest of the board.
Yes, I think there's consensus to add it, sir.
I would ask that the board consider the federal government too. I mean,
Yes.
so for me, back to policy is an edict to institutionalize what we believe. And if you look at the 6,000 policy, I mean, as you just stated, Ms. Kushner, that there's a ton of work that the federal government has to do as well, not just child nutrition. I have a whole list for them to do on that, but also funding IDEA. All of those things are federal funded changes that need to happen. And again, back to Dr. Crane's perspective, we shifted our language to acknowledge our relationship with the commissioners, but I certainly would assume the intent in those communities that don't have the relationship with their commissioners, it stands to beg the same for our state and federal government, that they all have a part in ensuring that we provide a sound basic education to all of our students, and specifically our most vulnerable students. Again, I clearly am making a clear, strong position to say, even in a 6,000 policy, even if you look at busing and transportation, all of those things have to be looked at through a lens of our most marginalized students. When we create our assignment policy, we're really going to go back and be committed to diversity. Well, that's going to include transportation as well. My opinion is I don't see how we do any Leandro substantive work without including our operational side of the house as well.
Right.
So that's just one board member's perspective, but I do feel the need, and I'm certainly, I have to see it written, my learning style, so I hear Mr. Sutton on his addition. That may fix the recommendation that I'm making, that we speak into the policy of it. But again, that's one board member saying, I certainly believe that this is a way to institutionalize this current board's perspective on Leandro.
Thank you. Ms. Mahaffey.
Thank you. Ms. Johnson-Hustler summarized it very well, and I was, simply going to add state and federal, because our commissioners, our state legislature, and the folks at the federal level are all elected officials, and so we want to highlight those relationships and those funding sources regardless of who's at that seat, because we don't live in a state where the school boards have funding authority. So I think it's important to highlight.
Yes, we do not, yes, we are dependent on other
And I'm not
legislative
complaining, I'm just
agencies.
stating.
That's right. It's the reality that we operate and govern in. Absolutely, absolutely. So I hear consensus to add state and federal sources to that second paragraph after our wonderful Board of Commissioners. And also, Dr. Crane, if you could take a look at the phrase that, Chair Sutton is suggesting after sound basic education, if there's a way to work in educational equity or reflect some of our other policy language when it, as it deals with the support services and operational services. Because I do think this board sees the operational services that are under this series as critical to accessing educational opportunity, as you've captured in this policy.
Ms. Kushner, one way to do that, this is Jonathan, would be if the board, does decide to reference sound basic education, to put an and, accessing educational opportunities to receive a sound basic education and to meet the of the board's strategic plan or something else where you're able to bring in all of the other important items that the board has around equity and its mission and vision and goals. And so you wouldn't then be limited to it, sound basic education, but you'd still reference it. That's maybe one way to approach it.
I think that captures both Dr. Martin and Mr. Sutton's concerns. So is there any objection to staff working that in? Okay. Any other suggestions before? Yes, Ms. Mahaffey.
I was just thinking as Mr. Sutton was mentioning, adding equity in there and the definition of it, and because that can mean different things to different people, just reiterating a question that's been raised before of having a standalone equity policy so that definition can be put out so that people understand what we mean as a board when we say that word.
I agree. So I'll definitely put that on the plan for policy. Thank you. Any other feedback before we entertain a motion to move this proposed policy 6,000 with the suggestions that have come up to come to us in February for action?
I'll make a motion to send this to first reading.
Thank you, Ms. Mahaffey. Is there a second? Second from Dr. Martin to bring the proposed policy 6,000 support services to the full board on the action agenda, given this is new policy. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Dr. Crane, Dr. Gardner, for that discussion and colleagues for that great feedback.
Thank you.
So next item is discussion around policy 4400, attendance. Superintendent Moore mentioned at our last work session that we would be reviewing this policy and looking for how it has been impacted and impacting our district during this school year and the COVID closure of school buildings. So, Ms. Moore.
I think we wanted to just highlight what modifications have been made, what's different this year with attendance, and then looking at what's in policy so that as we bring additional information forward that the board is interested in, that we have an understanding of what's in policy, what we're operationalizing, and clarity on what to bring forward.
Thank you, Ms. Moore. And we have Mr. Pittman and Mr. Coe with us to go over and provide some information to the board. So, Mr. Coe, Mr. Pittman, I'll leave it to you.
Thank you, Mrs. Kushner. Good afternoon, Superintendent Moore and board members. In today's discussion, we're going to be reviewing the Board Policy 4400 as it was updated earlier this school year to align with DPI guidance. And also, we wanted to present the factors tied to attendance record keeping as we operate under remote and in-person instructional models during this pandemic. And lastly, we wanted to share with you some of the actions we have taken as a district to support our students and families with attending school, be it remote or in person regularly. We have Brian Pittman, Dr. Pettiford, and Michael Pesch standing by to support with any questions and discussion. And I'll try to break off our conversation into 3 parts so that we have ample time for questions and discussion. And so in this first part, I wanted to first review the policy. Within Policy 4400, under Section A for attendance status per DPI guidance, we state that on-site instruction days, for students to be counted present during on-site instruction days, a student must be in attendance at least one half of the student's school day. And this includes attendance at official activities at a place other than the school with the approval of the principal. And a student shall be in his, her, their assigned area at the beginning of the school day and the beginning of each class to be recorded as tardy. And then in the second part of this section, we note about the policy notes about remote instruction days, where it says to be counted present during remote instruction days, either of the following 2 statements must be true. A student completes their daily assignments either online or offline, and or a student is present in synchronous live real-time instruction, or a student could have a daily check-in or 2-way communication in a manner acceptable to the school with the appropriate teachers as follows. In grades pre-K through 5, it would be the homeroom teacher, and in all other grade levels, it would be each course teacher listed on a student's schedule. And so with this policy, it notes that a student's failure to log into any particular online program or lesson on a given remote instruction day shall not be grounds to mark the student absent for the day, so long as the student meets one of the above criterias. And also, a teacher may subsequently change a student's attendance status from absent to present based on evidence of the student engagement submitted on a later date. So if a student has done any of the two things in the remote instruction section of completing an assignment or having a 2-way communication, this policy notes that a teacher should update that student to being present. And so with this policy, we've provided guidance to schools to make sure we take attendance in alignment with the updated policy 4400. We mark students present on site, present off site, absent excused, absent unexcused. And in pre-K through grades 5 and in our K-12 special ed regional programs, teachers take attendance daily through PowerSchool. And if a student is absent for 3 consecutive days, schools make 3 attempts to reach the student. And if they're unable to be reached, the student will be marked absent. In grades 6 through 12, daily period attendance is taken. So if a student has 4 blocks during a day, attendance should be taken for each period a student is scheduled to attend. If students are absent for 3 consecutive days, the school again makes attempts to reach the student. And if they're unable to be reached, the students will be marked absent. And just to note, across all of our grades, our school social workers and student assistance program coordinators, or SAPs, they work with our data managers and other student support services staff to coordinate the location of students. And our no-show due diligence efforts began when students expected did not show up at school at the start of the school year, and the due diligence processes are the ones our school social workers and SAPs engage in to locate students who are not regularly attending school, both remote and in-person settings. And so with this policy update and our guidance, some of the challenges we face with record keeping is that what used to be a more simple act of taking attendance creates more of an ever-fluid process that requires our teachers to constantly track and manage both the students who are present in synchronous, asynchronous, and in-person sessions, along with tracking the 2-way communication that happens between the student and the school. And also with this tracking, teachers must now track the students who may have been absent but turned in work or communicated in a school-approved format with the teacher listed on the student's schedules. So with that, I'll pause now here for any questions related to Policy 4400 or the attendance record-keeping challenges.
Thank you, Mr. Coe. Ms. Cash, and then Ms. Carter.
So under the remote instruction days, so I'm struggling right now, and I know you can help me on this, Mr. Coe. How does this attendance policy, how does it show us what the engagement of the student is? I'm trying to figure out how attendance measures engagement.
So,
Yeah.
Ms. Cash, I think that's a really good question for us to differentiate attendance and engagement. And we know that for you as board members, you expect our engagement, the engagement of our students to be high as they're attending school. But the policy, I think, to put it simply, is guiding us on how to mark attendance in terms of who is present. And just like we said earlier at the start of the school year, this DPI guidance and this policy was updated to provide as much grace and flexibility so that students have the opportunity to be marked present and not be punished in any way for being absent because they may have been going through device access issues or are just having challenges due to the pandemic. And so I don't know, I can't say that this policy specifically says engagement shall look like XYZ in terms of, I think, what you're describing of to what degree is a student fully engaged in doing the work and really into it from an energy standpoint, but this is guiding us more on how we can mark a student present or absent.
So if a teacher's internet was down and she simply sent an email out to the students to complete an assignment, then those students that completed the assignment would actually be counted in attendance that day, even though they were not. Yes,
so in this policy, if students completed an assignment that the teacher assigned asynchronously or over a class list email and the student completes that assignment, they can be marked present under this policy.
So Superintendent Moore, so I'm trying to figure out how we're going to know how much participation by the student online versus how many worksheets and things are completed by the student, because that would not be the same to me as being in attendance.
I think that is at the classroom level. There's not another way to gather that information but from each individual teacher at the classroom level, because that would be the same during a regular school year in terms of whether how a teacher is presenting instruction, whether it is paper worksheets or text materials or hands-on activities or an online tool or any other resource. They govern what they do during the time that they are with those children. So we would need to formulate questions that get at what we're trying to ask and really dig to the classroom level with each teacher, because they all have set expectations for their classrooms and their students around what those expectations are for when they are synchronous or asynchronous.
But if they're in the classroom and they're engaging in a worksheet of some sort, at least they're in attendance. And I think the teachers have a good idea of what the child is capable of doing. I'm not quite sure worksheets turned in remotely are a good measurement necessarily of what the child can do. So still, I know they're out of attendance when they're remote, but they're in the classroom and maybe a little different. I see what you're saying. I see the comparativeness of it, but I also see the gap of it.
And Ms. Cash, something I might add is that in terms of this policy, this policy is focused strictly on attendance, and we know that attendance has, by itself has never been an accurate measure of engagement. Kids who attend every day could be disengaged. And so we just wanted to clarify that this policy is specific to attendance and record keeping on how we can mark students present or absent. And it's not a policy dictating how engagement should look like.
I'm curious, just because I'm piggybacking off of Roxy. Jonathan, the General Assembly put remote learning days into our calendar this year. Did they have any guidance for attendance?
Not to my knowledge. The guidance that we're getting here is in relationship to the DPI guidance on lighting the way forward guidance.
Ms. Carter, that feedback.
I just want to finish with one thing. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just want to finish with one thing. I don't think engagement in the classroom I do believe that some kids are not engaged in the classroom. I understand that there's a million conversations around that, but I don't think engagement in the classroom is exactly the same as engagement remotely, but that's just an opinion. Okay, I'm sorry, Ms. Carter, go ahead.
Thank you, Ms. Cash.
Okay, I guess for me, my clarification would be, has staff reached out with PowerSchool to see what options are available? Because my understanding is, I think there are options where we could actually track attendance specifically about what type of attending the student is doing, whether or not they would be doing the two-way communication or turning in work or attending the live Google Meet. Has there been any work to see if that's done? Because that would be, whatever the code would be put into PowerSchool, and then we would be able to pull that data and have that, and it would align with our the policy that we're seeing here versus just covering the, to me, very broadly remote attendance, because the different type of remote attending as an educator has different implications for the education.
Thank you, Ms. Carter.
Ms. Carter.
There are 4 options, correct, Paul?
Yeah, and we're pretty locked in with what PowerSchool has offered because it needs to be aligned with what DPI has with the state. And so far there have not been any word of any codes in addition to those 4 of present on site, present off site, absent, excused, absent, unexcused.
I guess for clarification, has there been any advocacy to work to get those changes made with PowerSchool?
So I think
and
that
with
was
the state?
Yeah, that was covered first semester when we were very active with trying to figure out other options and not to mention an easier way for staff to actually engage in the attendance process because only of those 4 options, one is coded into the system as the default. And so now, in the past, you only had 2 options, and one was the default, and that was present. So you physically had to mark a child absent. Now, at present in person being the default, you have 3 other options that you have to go in and mark for. So it increased the workload on teachers tremendously. So there was a lot of conversation and work early on at the beginning of the year when schools were given these 4 options as the only 4 options in PowerSchool, but there were not any changes.
Thank you. I guess it's just disappointing because to me that means we really don't have an accurate data to go by as a board, and I feel that that leads to less accountability and also makes it very difficult to see the impact this side is having. So it's just disappointing to hear that that's not able to be presented to us, because I think it's valuable information that not only the board needs to see, but I think the public needs to see what level of attendance is occurring. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Carter. Ms. Mahaffey.
Thank you. Mr. Coe, I'm curious because under A2, Part A, where it says student completes their daily assignments either online or offline, that first part, student completes their daily assignments, I mean, we know in the classroom that doesn't always happen during the day. So what is the ability for teachers to look and say, okay, this percentage of the assignments have been turned in to be marked as present and remote versus, where we are, or is it, a strict adherence to completing every assignment that's given?
So thanks for that question, Ms. Mahaffey. I think that a lot of that determination of what you're asking, I think this, the teachers have license in how they approach the grading aspect with their students at the classroom level. But the guidance that we've provided as a district is that we said, given where we're at as a district, in terms have grace and patience with our students in terms of being able to mark them present. So if a student, say on Monday, didn't attend class, remotely, but then went online, accessed the work asynchronously, and then the following Wednesday completed the work, from Monday, that student should be marked present for this policy for Monday because they did that asynchronous work. But in terms of the level of completion on, does a student have to show up and do everything, to the T, and that's what counts as what marks them present. This policy is looser than that. It's a student can be present and attending, or it could be the two ways in the remote and under the remote instruction days of completing their daily assignments and or checking in with a teacher or the school approved way of communicating.
Okay, and I appreciate that flexibility, but also acknowledge that adds to the complexity that Superintendent Moore shared with marking students present or not present after the fact. And I know there are many districts across the country that are feeling that same concern with PowerSchool's limited options.
Thank you, Ms. Mahaffey. I think it also gets to some of the technical issues that have been raised, when internet goes out, and we've heard the frustrations around technology and other stresses of the pandemic. So I think allowing for that grace and asynchronous as well as synchronous participation is important. And I think as we stated when we revised this policy in the spring, that attendance and grading and evaluation are two different buckets, both with policy and how our teachers are and educators are evaluating our students, as well as recording this technical piece of attendance.
Yeah, so Ms. Kushner, with that point, the thing to also add is that, in honor of making sure that we're providing flexibility to our students, the counterpoint to that is that, our teachers have taken on a great burden to track this flexibility to make sure that they're marking students present and tracking all the work and, all the extra time it takes. So that's one of the added dimensions of how how teaching has shifted in the midst of this pandemic since March.
Right. It used to be as simple as taking, a piece of paper, making checks and sending the student down to the office with the list, right? So it's a normal doesn't live here anymore. It's my mantra. Any other comments or questions around this policy 4400? Questions for Superintendent Moore or staff?
Ms. Kushner, I think Mr. Haggerty and I both have our.
I'm so sorry. I've not checked that lately. So Mr. Haggerty and then Ms. Scott, thank you for that.
Thank you. And thank you, Ms. Scott. I appreciate that. Really, what I was just hoping for is if we could take a little moment for education, about education here. When we talk about how much work it is to keep attendance, right? I don't know if everyone in the community understands what goes into that, because it sounds simple enough. Well, you have one code that you enter into PowerSchool. How much harder would it be just to enter a different code, right? But it's been referenced now that it's a lot more work to track attendance through the daily check-ins, to the asynchronous assignments, and other things that we're using as alternatives. And I was just wondering if, Dr. Koh could speak just a little more descriptively about what goes into keeping attendance now and how that's different than what we were doing before.
So I think one example that I might give is that, at the middle school level, one of the shifts that have happened is that instead of just marking the daily period attendance similar to pre-K5, now, we've shifted because we want to be able to track as a district, not just the daily attendance, but for students in middle school and high school who attend period by period. If they attend math class but then miss all of English class, we know that there's a problem there. And so we didn't want to not be able to track those. So when you look at that, where we've moved from daily attendance prior, the shift to have to track, attendance across all periods for all students, and simultaneously tracking, Jimmy wasn't there on Monday, but I have to remember that he turned in work on Tuesday, so I have to go back and change that attendance for the first block on Monday, so on and so forth. And so if a teacher has a class load of 165 kids, you could see all the different ways the tracking mechanisms could be challenging for someone who hasn't had to do that before.
And I just want to be clear because I don't want there to be confusion. Are you saying that in high school and middle schools that have periods attendance, I know that there is daily attendance kept in homeroom, but are you saying individual teachers don't keep track of attendance in their classroom?
No, at the high schools, the period-by-period attendance has been happening, but with this updated guidance, we made a decision to make sure that across 6-12, because our students have, specifically in 6th through 8th grades, instead of just daily attendance, we shifted it to period-by-period attendance because we felt like in this pandemic, making sure we understand where our kids are at, that was a new practice that we made sure our schools were doing so that we know the full breadth of where students are attending and where they're not.
Okay, except that, didn't you just tell me, and I don't mean to be dense, but didn't you just tell me that they were keeping track of attendance period by period?
No, so just to break it down, in pre-K 5, there aren't, there's a 4-period block, right? So it's more about does the student attend for half or more of the day to be marked present. That's the guidance. And before, middle schools were on under similar guidance. But as we had to shift our attendance guidance with DPI, we felt that as a district, guiding all secondary schools 6-12 to be taking attendance how high schools have always taken attendance, that was an important shift that we added, and that was the difference in middle schools. And that shift has been some of the challenges for our middle school teachers to go from, not just tracking whether students attended 50% more of the day, but having to track all the periods that they're teaching. I hope that clarifies a little further.
Was that because of the cohort model in middle school, that students were more moving in a group rather than going from one period to another independently like our high schools do?
Actually, I'm gonna, Drew Cook just texted me, and I think he can also jump in to add some insights. So I'm gonna let Drew jump in and add to our conversation.
Thanks, Paul. I think you covered it essentially. And just for a little bit of historical context, Mr. Haggerty, I think at the middle school level, up until this school year, there had been variance from school to school as to whether or not every teacher in the building took period by period attendance in Power School, as opposed to just daily attendance in Power School. All of our teachers in all of our middle schools have always kept up with their period attendance. The question mark and the option that Power School would allow is whether or not that the school adopted that as their official mechanism via Power School. This school year, right, given the circumstances, given the uncertainty with kids and where they are, we felt like as a district it was important to track that officially via Power School at the middle school level systemically for the very first time. And so that was a new ask for teachers at the middle school level. High school teachers have always done it. But I think just to reemphasize what Mr. Coe was describing, and I don't think we can overemphasize, right, the work that a teacher now has to engage in just to mark kids present. As Ms. Moore mentioned a little while ago, it used to be if you had 150 students and you had 5 kids that were absent, you would just mark 5 kids absent because the default was present. Now, with Power School at the state level, and we did press on Power School, we did press on DPI early in the year, and to impress upon them the workload, that now it meant that any district that has remote instruction occurring, right, as is the case systematically for all of us right now, every time a student is marked present remote, a button has to be pushed manually. That is not the default. The default is present in person. Right. And that's in addition to whether or not they're absent. And then just to add additional work, right, on top of that, teachers have to retroactively now, potentially several days after they've already marked attendance accurately, have to go back and adjust whom they marked absent and keep up with what day I assigned what assignment and which day I should go back and change it from absent remote to present remote. right? So I don't think we can overemphasize your point, and I think your question for the public. It is a time-consuming endeavor on top of many others for our teachers every single day. And so I think by nature, that process itself opens itself up to additional opportunities for inaccuracies through nobody's fault, right? So I think your point is well taken, and I hope that kind of paints a picture of the complexity of just taking attendance every single day that every one of our teachers have to engage in.
You have answered that comprehensively and perfectly, and I completely understand now. Well done. I appreciate that.
Thank you for raising the issue, Mr. Hegarty. Ms. Scott.
Thank you so much, and I feel like part of my question was absolutely answered. Attendance absolutely is complex. I can't even begin to imagine doing this. But I wanted to use this opportunity just to share some feedback that I receive from teachers occasionally, and that is that balance of attendance as accountability, having the opportunity to hold students accountable with not, if there's a broadband issue or whatever, that fine balance. I hope I'm making sense here. So I know that that's been discussed in the past, but I just had to bring it up that continues to be an issue. And I'm curious if Google Classroom has brought anything to help with this in terms of attendance. I would love to think that the technology would be able to help teachers track with who logged in with their classrooms rather than having to go through that lengthy start of class. And there absolutely is a difference between in attendance and engagement, and I appreciate that being amplified as well.
I see Ms. Gaddis turn on her video.
Yes, I sure did. Thank you for the question, Ms. Scott. Google Classroom does have, well, not just Google Classroom, but Google Meet does have a feature now that at the end of every single meet, the owner of the meet gets an attendance report. And so it will tell you how many minutes somebody was in and at what time they've logged out. So teachers do get that at the end of every single session that they have. So that is a feature that we do have access to.
That's great. And I would hope at some point if I don't know computer, this is where I appreciate all the work that you do. My husband's a software and I always say he does the click, click, click for his job. But I would hope that there could even possibly in the future be a way to take that file information to have it communicate with PowerSchool, for districts, even though using Zoom. I mean, there are a lot of these online classrooms and online collaborative software that I assume are doing similar types of tracking to make things a little easier for educators, and then working with existing software to just try to ease the burden that folks are experiencing.
I will just speak to the fact that, the ed tech community is catching up. They, like all of us, are realizing we need solutions in different ways to meet the needs. And so I would imagine things such as your suggestion might be coming in the future in new features. But we are certainly continuing to talk with DPI. In fact, I spoke with them again last night around the attendance issue. And so they're well aware of some of the issues that we're having, and we'll continue to push each day.
Thank you so much for that. And Ms. Kushner, as I have a musician at home practicing right now, I'm going to just leave my questions right there.
I was enjoying that. Thank you, Ms. Scott. Thank you, Ms. Gaddis. Any other feedback, information for staff around attendance? All right. Thank you.
Ms. Kushner, I just wanted to add one more update to the second, if it was possible. So, like our teachers have been working hard, I also wanted to make sure I share the work that folks are doing at the school level and district level to support the students who are not attending regularly and figure out ways to support them. We know that, we don't want to just say we have absent students and we don't know what to do. And so as a testament to the work of our principals, our school level staff, teachers, and central office staff, I wanted to provide some examples of what our teams are doing to make sure we don't take our foot off the gas on how to keep students connected to school, because we know that there's a much better chance when kids attend, the possibility of engagement and learning is much higher. And so a few of the examples are, our school levels, our schools have student support services PLT teams, and where members are consult about specific student cases to share, either individual strategies to help out that student or school-wide systematic strategies. And they also have attendance team meetings to keep track of attendance and make sure that both the student services and school leaders are problem solving. And just as a friendly reminder, how food security efforts have kind of connected with the attendance work is that through a partnership, specifically with our school social work department and the Wake County Cooperative Extension outreach efforts, we've partnered with our community members to provide food and health resources while also serving families about needs at Saturday, at weekend, and also weekday events. And just as a friendly reminder, we've used CARE funds to hire on community liaisons who provide supplemental support. And in terms of the community liaisons, we are working hard to get their 2021 contracts going for a February 1 start date. And they'll provide additional supplemental social work services, conduct home visits, deliver devices, and troubleshoot connectivity and engagement issues. We also have a contract through CARES funds for supportive counseling to provide counseling services to students who may be struggling with issues that may prevent them from attending or engaging in school. And it goes to our principals who are doing home visits and our school level folks who do home visits, before they even reach out to the community liaisons for help. And they try to make direct contact with students and families to troubleshoot the attendance, connectivity, and engagement issues that may be going on. As part of the due diligence efforts and just in general practice, there's phone calls that are made to make sure that we reach out to families and make sure that those who are not attending regularly are connected. And we also provide supports with social workers and our district court liaisons, providing school consultations to make sure that school leadership develop plans and strategies to support school attendance. And we did student parent wellness sessions last fall, and we're planning to launch them again starting February. And we have evening and Saturday sessions that talk about trauma awareness, building relationships, family encouragement, healthy at-home tips to thrive and survive, topics focused on motivation and engagement, anxiety in the time of COVID, helping children manage emotions, and helping kids survive virtual learning, and also finding balance. So I just wanted to make sure that was noted to the board as well, so that we understand that there are actions being taken right now that our school teams and central office services teams are working really hard at. And after that, I'll pause here for any further questions or discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Coe. And if you could, any information on that you can share with us is welcome. Ms. Cash had a comment.
I was going to mention, I wasn't actually going to talk about this today, but and thank you, Mr. Coe, for all the things that is being done in our schools to help the kids that are not being engaged and that are struggling in probably a lot of the areas that we actually are seeing in our feeding programs when we go out. However, I understand there's a couple schools, because there's a lot going on in our schools, and our principals are handling a lot of stuff, and they're trying to have volunteers help them, such as Activate Good was going to help with a pilot program with one of the schools in my district. But at this point, it's been on hold for maybe a couple months, because our legal team can't figure out a way for the volunteers to help in that school. So the principals in our schools that need extra help, and there's a lot of volunteers out there, especially through Activate Good, that would like to help. I would like to figure out a way, or what the barriers are that we are running into, and I think actually Dr. Matilda's been involved in this a little bit. We need to figure out a way that our legal team does not feel like our volunteers cannot help our principals.
If I could speak to that, our firm was recently asked to work with Activate Good to try to develop an MOU. And we are actively working to do that in collaboration with Activate Good, and are optimistic that we're going to be able to work through those issues. We're not placing any barrier whatsoever to the idea of volunteering students remotely, and are optimistic and trying to expedite that. But we've only been recently asked to work on an MOU along those lines, and we see it as a top priority. We appreciate the initiative and are happy to help.
And thank you, Jonathan. I actually know that, we've been working on this for at least almost 3 months, and I don't know who said what, but during that time, there are a lot of children that are really struggling. So urgency might be the word I'm trying to look at, that we need to do. So an MOU, it's taken a while to get that together, and I think we need to move quickly. I hadn't brought that up publicly, but I did today.
Thank you, Ms. Cash. And Ms. Carter.
Right, and I just want to appreciate all the follow-up that staff does for students not attending and outreach. I think that's very important. I guess a concern I have, and just to seek clarification, is that only if there's no attendance at all, or is, let's say there's a student that has two-way communication option for a set amount of time, is that a red flag? Would staff be following up then? Or if, you know what I'm saying? I'm just trying to see, because I've heard from some school counselors that have concerns, and they may be marked present or attending, but it's the type of attendance they're doing, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? Hope that's clear.
No, it's a good.
Yes,
I'm just trying
Carter.
to see kind of what the threshold is, and if there is anything district-wide, or if it's just teacher by teacher, school by school, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so Ms. Carter, I think the circumstance that you describe are things that our individual schools are very well aware of. And I think, like you said, our counselors are definitely aware of situations where a student may be attending, but there may be more withdrawn for other reasons. And I think those are reasons absolutely as to why supports will be sought out. And, in a situation like that, something like supportive counseling might be a good road to go to check in on the student, because like in a previous statement, just because a student is attending, it does not mean that there is a lack of potential issues or needed supports a student may be experiencing, because I think a lot of our families have been working through the pandemic. I think a lot of our students have dealt with housing transition or housing issues, food security. And so all those things do play a part. And I can assure you that our schools work hard to take note of that, just beyond attendance. And I think it kind of shows you how much the attendance policy opens up to all kind of the behavioral health and academic needs that our students and families have. But in terms of the marking of attendance, there's some technical things that make things just a little bit complicated.
Thank you for that, because that was a concern, and I'm glad to hear that, it didn't just solely by being marked attending. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Carter. And I think, we as a board recognize that we were underfunded in school social workers and school psychologists and counselors before a pandemic hit us. And it certainly has strained our already strained resources. So thank you for raising those important questions. And Mr. Coe, thank you for that added information. Any other questions or feedback for staff before we move on to our next area of discussion? We talked about bringing forward, again, for discussion and feedback, policy 3460, graduation requirements. As we heard at our last work session meeting, they all blend in together right now. As we remember last year in the 2019-2020 school year, the state made certain decisions around graduation requirements, and that is not expected to happen again this year. But I certainly raised the issue because I know, we've done the impact studies, of the Wake County Public School System on Wake County and the value of a high school diploma to individuals and to our community. So during a time of a pandemic and the disruption that have happened, wanted to draw attention to the upcoming, our class of 2021, which has been even harder hit by the pandemic. So Mr. Pittman is here to discuss and highlight update on under this policy 3460 at graduation requirements. Mr. Pittman, welcome.
Well, good afternoon, Committee Chair Kushner, members of the board, and Superintendent Moore. It is always my pleasure to be with you to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is graduation. Today, we're going to provide you some updates around graduation policies and pathways to support our students in reaching the graduation stage on time. In our discussion today, I'm going to provide you a brief overview of the policies around high school graduation, as well as provide some information on some work that we are doing as a district to support our students in reaching their graduation goal.
And thank you, Mr. Pittman. Just if you don't mind me interrupting, I just saw that it's 5 o'clock, so I recognize that we're going over time, and I appreciate everyone holding on for us to cover this important topic. Thank you. So continue, Mr. Pittman. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem at all. As we begin our discussion, I think it may be helpful for us to first ground ourselves in policies at the state and local level that provide a foundation for how our students reach graduation. State Board of Education policy establishes a statewide minimum graduation requirements for students across the state of North Carolina. Key among those requirements are 22 course credits towards graduation, successful completion of specific courses designated as Future Ready Core, including English, Math, Science, Social Studies courses, as well as other designated electives. And there are also components of non-academic requirements, such as the completion of the CPR training. Beyond the state policy, each local district also establishes graduation requirements. Much as we have seen with other guidance during the pandemic, our policy can be more rigorous than the state, but it cannot relax or alter the minimum standards or baseline that the state sets. Our board policy 3460 outlines graduation requirements in the Wake County Public School System. Specifically, we choose as a district to require 26 credits at our comprehensive high schools. Put this into perspective, most students have the opportunity to attempt 32 credits over the course of their high school career. Successfully completing 26 credits means that the student has earned at least 80% of the 32 credits attempted. The 4 additional credits, or the difference between the requirement of 22 by the state and our local requirement of 26, can be made up of advanced core content courses such as honors or AP courses, or elective courses from CTE, arts, or healthful living. Our board policy has always provided the ability to graduate at 22 credits based on an alternative program of study. Specifically, our alternative schools, high schools, require 22 credits, as do our cooperative innovative high schools, such as our early colleges and career academies, due to their unique program requirements and university collaborations. Our policy also speaks to students on a modified schedule, as approved by the principal, having this opportunity to graduate at 22 credits as well. During the 2019-2020 school year, the circumstances of the pandemic did create a unique situation where the state gave greater direction related to the graduation policy. Specifically, the state directed that local school districts could not exceed the state's minimum requirements when determining high school graduation status for the class of 2020. This meant that we applied the 22 credit expectation to all of our high schools, not our locally chosen 26 credits. The state direction applied last year only applied to the class of 2020. And as you said, Ms. Kushner, it is not in effect for this school year, and at present we do not anticipate getting similar direction for this year or the class of 2021 from the state. With that background information, I am going to invite you to look forward with me to the graduates of the class of 2021 and beyond. Starting prior to the pandemic, we were working with high schools to develop a system approach to how we could address the needs of our students related to high school graduation. While our policy has always provided principals at our comprehensive high schools the authority to graduate a student with less than the locally required 26 credits, again, in that modified schedule approved by the principal, we have worked to develop greater district-wide consistency in applying our own board policy. Specifically, we've worked to better answer the question of when and under what circumstances a principal at a comprehensive high school that requires 26 credits can graduate a student within the framework of our existing board policy when the student has between 22 and 25 credits. To be clear, all students must meet the state's graduation requirements. We do not have the ability to waive or adjust that. We do have the ability and the desire to take into account things that are outside of the student's ability to control. Let me provide you a few examples of students who may help you put this into context. Consider a high school senior who has earned less than 8 credits most years in their high school journey due to the impact of mental or physical health and well-being. They've not necessarily failed courses, but they have been unable to carry a full course load. They've met all state graduation requirements and would be returning to us in the summer or for a 5th year of high school, in some cases only for elective credit courses. Similarly, we may have a student who has found themselves with dramatically different home or life conditions as a result of the pandemic, or other variety of situations that existed pre-pandemic. Again, they still meet the state graduation requirements, but without this process, they could be extending high school into a 5th year only to complete additional electives. Certainly, there is tremendous value in those elective courses, but the value may not outweigh the opportunity to graduate with their peers and the value of the opportunities for what they do after they cross the graduation stage that they would be missing. While this list of examples could go on and on, in short, the goal is to give schools a clear structure for how they can work with students to meet their graduation goals without necessarily meeting the 26 credit requirement that we have locally when they have circumstances that are beyond their control. We acknowledge that while at a district level we can discuss students on the whole, here we are very specifically talking about individuals, each with their own journey and story. I think it's important to clearly note this pathway to graduation that I've described of allowing students to graduate with the 22 to 25 credits when there are circumstances outside of their control is not an attempt to make it easier to get to graduation. It is, however, an attempt to recognize that not all of what our students learn in high school happens in the classroom or results in a credit towards graduation. And that for some of our students, the path to the graduation stage is much more difficult. As a district, we recognize that and choose to be a partner with that student. Just to give you a brief glimpse of the logistics of how this would work, I'll provide this very brief overview. If a school in consultation with the parent and the student believe that the student might be considered for this option, they would submit a request to the district. A district team that includes several district staff members would review that information, the information available, and let the school know whether the student situation aligns to the intended purpose of this option. Ultimately, of course, the high school principal is the only one who can determine that the student has met graduation standards and confirm them. This process has been developed through ongoing consultation with schools and will continue to change as we learn from the process over the next several years. It is also important to know that as a district team, we are not only looking at the students who are submitted for review, by the school, but we're also working with schools to identify students who may benefit from this opportunity but have not been submitted. Again, this is a learning process for us as a district team and the school, but we are trying to look at it as comprehensively as we can. This, of course, does invite a question: how would a student know that they have this option for graduation? Academic counseling is the primary method. While it will be included in the high school program planning guide, a wonderful document that I would say is far too infrequently considered literature for good reading, we do know that the investment in relationships with students and parents will ultimately be the primary method and the most effective method of sharing this message and this opportunity. In summary, our hope is that with this work, that we may make a meaningful impact for individual students while also having some greater consistency across the district and implementation of this opportunity. I'm happy to provide additional details or answer questions. I'm fortunate to have the knowledgeable and talented Director of School Counseling, Crystal Reardon, also here on the call to answer questions as well. And thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Pittman, and I'm going to highlight your literature, your taste in literature and good reading. It is the end goal, so I'm not going to argue with you, sir. Thank you. Ms. Mahaffey, let's open our feedback.
Thank you, Ms. Kushner, and thank you, Mr. Pittman, for highlighting that flexibility that you're offering, in which we're able to with our high schoolers that are looking at graduation. And I especially appreciated that piece at the end on how we're going to work with those students and get that communication, and highlighting the importance of parent communication with the school to help share their student struggles. And I know many of our students are great advocates for themselves. One of the questions that I had was, how do parents know that they have that ability to contact that school regarding it? I think sometimes, we're used to, as parents, knowing that we can go to the school and have that conversation, and not every parent has that comfort with contacting the school in that piece. So how do we let parents know that that's a conversation that they can be having with our schools if they feel that their child is in that position?
So I think that it's important to highlight that, one, that this option is really focused on where there are factors outside of the student's control, and that may not really apply to all students. Similarly, it's not an option that is intended to allow students to graduate early or mid-year. This is intended to be an option for students to be able to graduate on time. And so I think that academic counseling piece that hopefully is ongoing throughout the time in high school is important in a way that happens. But I think that also sort of highlights the need for us as a district and for schools to take a look at the data surrounding their students. And so if a student were to have a certain number of credits, for example, right now at the end of the fall semester of their senior year, then there may be some indication there, or the number of credits at the beginning of their senior year, then there may be some indication there, because again, with graduation, we're talking about credit attainment. Somewhere in there may be an indication that we need to be proactively reaching out to the parent or the student to be sure that we understand the challenges that they may face in getting to the graduation. And so part of this is trying to make parents aware of the opportunity through the academic counseling process. But part of this is us reviewing data that's available to us about credit attainment and being proactive about reaching out to families to be sure that they know about not only this opportunity, but also other supports that are available to be sure that they are able to cross that graduation stage with their peers.
And my second question was just simply, if a student does not have their CPR piece, how are they getting that in a remote environment?
So that's a great question. We have worked with the schools across the district to have some drive-by CPR trainings that we were able to do while fully remote. They have settled down a little during some of the colder weather, but we'll pick that back up in the spring. But most of the instructional piece can be handled remotely with students, and the work with the mannequin to demonstrate that, because it is simply the chest compressions, really has been able to be successfully accomplished through some of those drive-by opportunities, similar to how students would pick up instructional materials.
Thank you.
That's amazing. It's hard because the CPR is required for high school graduation in North Carolina and wasn't waived. Well, I guess a medical pandemic's not the time to waive a medical requirement, I suppose. Anyhow, so thank you for raising that, Ms. Mahaffey. Ms. Cash, Ms. Carter?
I'm all for helping our children graduate, and this has been a rough time for them, so I appreciate all these efforts and what we're doing here. I think my question is, now is this similar to the other high schools in the state? Will they be treating these credits the same way, or if a child graduates, are they on equal standing with other high schools in the state to get into the college of their choice?
So, Ms. Cash, I think it's an excellent question. And I think that in part, what I would say is that it is as equal a standing as it was prior to the pandemic. For example, there are districts within our state that only require the state's minimum requirement of 22 credits. There are some districts within the state that require more than the 26 credits that we provide. And so I think that in terms of the equal footing, if they graduate with 24 instead of 26 credits, I think that's as equal comparing with other districts as it's been in the past. I also think that, to their credit, our college and university partners have looked very thoughtfully at a much more well-balanced perspective of our students' profile than simply the number of credits, and tried to look at the rigor of that, their success with it, but also the other opportunities that they've had that may be shared outside of the high school transcript that show their leadership and high quality and why they would be a wonderful addition to that college or university.
Okay, thank you. I just don't want them to have a false security that they're going to be competitive for the best schools if that's not the case. But I'm glad that that won't be the case. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cash. Ms. Carter?
Yes, I guess I wanted to piggyback on Ms. Mahaffey's comments a little bit, because I have concerns about the communication of this. I guess too often I feel like a lot of stuff is done with students in high school because I know they're encouraging being independent, speaking up for themselves, but I also know there are a lot of high school students who struggle with that. And if they are needing help, won't speak up, or if someone reaches out and gives them an option, they kind of keep it to themselves. And so I really would like for parents to have and families to have a clear understanding of this and what is available, because I just worry when we rely too much on school-based stuff. I feel like a lot needs to come more from the district because I've just seen, with several issues where I feel like the communication needs to be very clear and direct and intentional. So I just want to reiterate that a little bit. And then I know you had mentioned special circumstances outside of their control. And for clarification, would the remote learning piece be something that you all would consider as a circumstance outside of their control? Because I know I've heard from a lot of high school families where students are really struggling since March with remote learning. So if you could just speak to that just a little bit.
Sure. And Ms. Carter, I would echo your statement of the importance of parents being an equally involved partner in this process. And that is something we worked into the process of the school making the request, is being sure that the parent is engaged in making that request. Although, of course, in some cases where our students are 18, then they have taken on some of that responsibility for themselves. I do think that when you talk about some of the remote learning, is that a special circumstance? So, I think the answer to that is it could be. We have many students who have thrived and done well, and that wouldn't be a special circumstance. I think it's safe to say that all of us have struggled to some degree while we've tried to engage in the teaching or the learning side of remote learning, and how do we find the success that we want to with that. I think for some students, the current situation with, and I wouldn't say remote learning, I think I would say with the pandemic, because I think it's potentially broader than that. There could be something with remote learning, whether access to a device or connectivity. There could be something with learning style. There could be something with change of home situation or conditions that doesn't allow a student to focus as heavily on the attainment of their credits as they had in the past. It could be a financial need to work and support the family that has come up as a result of the pandemic, that has limited the student's ability to carry a full load. And so I would say to you, I think there are certainly going to be circumstances where a pandemic-related situation would absolutely fall into this. But I think it's probably, I would just characterize it beyond probably the remote learning. I think I would say there will be things related to the pandemic and COVID that would certainly fall outside of the student's control and impact their ability to fully engage in the way that they may want to in finishing high school as strongly as they may want to.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Carter. Any other questions, feedback from board members? Thank you for allowing us to highlight this important aspect of the current work. I appreciate it.
And Ms. Kushner, if I may.
Yes, Mr. Haggerty.
Thanks. I'll be quick because of the hour. I do want to just reiterate what Ms. Mahaffey and Ms. Carter have said about, the importance of the flexibility that is out there for students and the importance of making sure parents know about it. I've had several incidents where, parents have approached me about something that had seemed to have risen almost to like a crisis state about a child's impending graduation and a challenge they would have that could be resolved and was resolved successfully after consultation with the principal to allow the withdrawal from classes that weren't needed for graduation. But there was still some confusion out there over how many hours were needed, how many weren't. And so, again, if I could just reinforce the importance of making sure, we're communicating to parents that they should reach out, to their principals about these challenges, that we can work with them, and there are some options out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Haggerty.
Mr. Haggerty, I would echo that and say that that's the great advice is reach out to your school principal, because I think our school principals are able to solve a great many things. But I also think that that I would highlight just again, and it goes back to how do we communicate this? How do we make sure people are aware? And I think that the more that we have some greater district involvement, not for control's sake, but for understanding's sake and consistency's sake, we'll learn more about the depth of the need of our students as it relates to this. And I think that will drive us to how do we best communicate that? How do we best partner and engage on this topic? But I agree with you. I think talking to your school principal is certainly the first best step that any family can take.
Thank you.
And I'm hearing lots of agreement around the board that we need to make sure we're communicating and that schools are connecting with students, because this is such an important year-end goal and such an important, it is what we do, getting our kids across that stage and graduating. So thank you for the attention to this topic and for emphasizing the need to get this information out to students, families, and also to lift up the great work that's already happening at our school levels and our high schools, the leadership of our principals and their teams. So thank you. Superintendent Moore, any further comments or concerns? Any from my colleagues? I appreciate the going late with us and the attention to all 4 of these topics. So with no further ado, the policy committee is now adjourned. Thank you.